Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Today we're going to be diving deep into the intricacies of internet governance, corporate control and legislative impacts on our connected world and so much more. And with me to unpack these dense but vital topics is a gentleman called Andrew Sullivan, the president and CEO of the Internet Society, which is a global non-profit at the nexus of shaping how we all experience the internet. But enough for me. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Toronto, where Andrew is waiting to speak with us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am Andrew Sullivan. I'm the president and CEO of the Internet Society. The Internet Society is a nonprofit. It's a little over 30 years old, and we try to make sure that the internet is for everyone. And this really boils down to two things. One is that we try to make sure that people who aren't connected to the internet have the opportunities that the internet provides. Almost a third of the world's population doesn't have access to the internet, or they have inadequate access to the internet. And so that's one thing that we work on. And the other thing that we work on, which I think we're going to probably spend more time on today, is trying to make sure that, the internet remains a resource for humanity. And that involves a number of policy issues that, we'll probably touch on.
And it is such an important topic. And I love that vibe you've got there about having the internet for everyone. And I think over the years, we have seen a slow erosion of the internet foundations and everything that it was built for. And one of the reasons that attracted me to you and why I wanted to get you on these podcasts is I've read that you've mentioned that efforts to regulate applications, particularly by big tech, they're playing a big part in eroding those foundation elements of the internet. So can you elaborate on what these foundations are and why they're so crucial for the internet to function effectively, just to set the scene for our conversation today?
Sure. So the internet, it's easy to forget this foundational issue, because we have this experience of the internet as a smooth whole. But in fact, the internet is made up of many different networks. It's right there in the name. It's the internet. It's a network of networks. And what that means, of course, is that each individual network has its own priorities. They're built for different purposes. A corporate network, for instance, is not built like an access network like your local ISP. They're built in different ways, but they all use the same fundamental protocols and exchange traffic without anybody being in charge. And this is it's almost magical, the fact that the internet works at all, and yet it works remarkably well because we've built a reliable system out of unreliable parts. And that all depends on this loose coordination, this everybody implementing the same protocols the same way, so that all of the networks can talk to each other without anybody being involved. And this involves a certain amount of distributed governance. It involves very loose coordination among all of the participants. And it involves people adopting the same fundamental technologies. What that does is it gives us a network that really gives a lot of power to the user. It gives a lot of control to the people who are implementing things on your network. You make your rules. And the only rule to participate in the internet is that you have to implement all of the protocols the same way as other people. But you don't have to implement all of them. You can implement just some things because that's the way you want to participate. And that feature of the internet is part of what has made it so successful. But what we're starting to see now, of course, is that people are treating the internet as a single unified thing rather than this distributed network. And what we start to get are regulations and attempts at control that are quite harmful to the fundamental nature of the network.
And of course, we're also seeing large corporations who are increasingly being accused of almost enclosing the internet, favoring apps over open web systems. So what would you say are the long-term implications of this trend for both consumers and smaller businesses? And how does this affect the democratizing potential of the internet too?
It's a good question. The internet is sort of designed in a world where there are a lot of different networks and a lot of different implementations that are roughly the same size as one another, so that they're not, huge imbalances. But in fact, as we see, in deployment, we have these kind of rock star economies where certain companies end up with a whole lot of control. And that is a kind of consolidation and concentration on the internet that has consequences for the way the system works. Now, this isn't all bad. There are things about concentration and consolidation that actually deliver huge advantages to us. A good example of this is cloud computing. Cloud computing doesn't work if you have a whole lot of cloud providers, because the whole way that cloud computing works is through economies of scale. So you need a cloud computing provider to be huge so that they can buy all of the capacity speculatively and have those things available when somebody comes along and needs it. A good example of this from recent history is near the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when everybody stayed home and everybody had to go on to Zoom or other sort of online conferencing systems. And Zoom in particular grew enormously, like, hundreds of times, very, very, very quickly. And they were able to do this because they were hosted in a cloud environment. That cloud provider had been busy buying machines and buying network capacity and so on the assumption that somebody was going to come along and use it. And then when Zoom had a whole lot of load thrown at them, they could just add more capacity very quickly. When I first started working on the internet, that would have been months of procurement problem in order to grow your application that way. And so that's an example of how concentration and consolidation can be advantageous. On the other hand, because the internet was designed around the idea of a network of networks, if a few very large providers, very large applications or very large corporations own all of the capacity, you quickly find that you can't have new competitors. You get sort of slowing in innovation, and you get a sort of complacency around the business of the internet. It becomes a very conservative place rather than one that allows for a lot of innovation. And I think that's the risk that we're facing with the internet today. We get a lot of consolidation. It's no secret that we have certain giant corporations that are really dominating the nature of the traffic on the internet.
And in their defense, governments are attempting to regulate some of those large corporations through broad regulation and proposals, etc. And I know you're talking to me in Toronto today. One of those that spring to mind to me is the Canada's Online News Act, or over here in the EU, the Digital Markets Act. But again, it's not all plain sailing. Can you expand on some of the unintended consequences of such a broad rush approach to the internet ecosystem?
Well, one challenge, I think, is that governments very often have inadequate understanding of what the regulations that they're proposing are going to do to the internet. And sometimes that's because they haven't fully understood the environment into which they are, into which they're deploying their regulations. Sometimes it's because the nature of the regulation is so large that maybe nobody can really understand it. I think the EU's Digital Markets Act is kind of like that. It's huge and sprawling, and it's very difficult to understand what its consequences are. The Internet Society created a toolkit for policymakers to use. We sort of modeled it on environmental assessment. So, if you build a bridge or a dam or whatever, you try to figure out what the consequences are going to be in the natural environment. Maybe you're going to wipe out an ecosystem or something like that. And then you have to think, is this worth it? And so we've tried to do the same thing for the internet. We call it the Internet Impact Assessment. And it would be helpful if more of those were done on proposed legislation before people go ahead and adopt the legislation. For instance, in the case of Canada's Online News Act, one of the things we predicted was that the targets of that act would inevitably just block the content that Canada was attempting to regulate. And sure enough, that is what has happened. Canada, you can't post news articles on Facebook, for instance, from Canada because Meta has decided that they just don't want that kind of traffic on the platform because it creates a liability for them. This was something that we could predict. We did predict it, but unfortunately, the impact assessment wasn't done in time. I think that's an unfortunate consequence, and it's one that we're going to see more and more of as we proceed with regulations without really understanding what it does, how it actually rolls out on the internet.
And the debate around Section 230 has also gained traction, especially in the US, where many see it as almost allowing web operators, large and small, to moderate user speech and content as they see fit. While the idea of holding large tech companies seems accountable and appealing, what would you say the ripple effects on other service operators like ISPs, websites, or even podcasts are?
Yeah, so in the United States, Section 230 is the law that provides protection for intermediaries so that they're not liable for the content that goes through them. So, an intermediary, for instance, on the internet is the network that we're sending packets over right now, or it might be a hosting provider who happens to host your content. And of course, if you are liable for your content, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to have happen. But if your hosting provider is also liable for that content, then they're going to be chilled from hosting it, or they're going to be chilled from carrying the traffic across their network, and so on. Now, the challenge is that there are cases where providers of services online are not doing enough, according to the wider society, to try to solve some of the consequences of some of the content that is carried across it. So obvious examples of this are, people are concerned about hate speech or misinformation or whatever that is carried across your favorite social media platform. And under those circumstances, there are legislators who want to hold the platform accountable. Part of the reason they want to hold the platform accountable, of course, is because the platform it has a lot of money, it has a lot of resources to throw at this problem, and the question is, why aren't they doing it? Now, the challenge is that if you change this intermediary liability regime, it isn't just the giant platforms that are going to be subject to that. Instead, what you get is a situation in which everybody who is an intermediary becomes liable for content that is there. And this means, as you say, like a podcast, for instance, if you put up your podcast and somebody puts a comment on the podcast, but that comment is hateful or libelous or something like that, suddenly you are liable for the comment that was added to the podcast download, and that that seems like a very bad situation. It will tend to discourage people from interacting online, and one of the main things that the internet brought for us was this ability for people to communicate more directly with one another. That there isn't a gatekeeper standing in the way. And that is a positive development in many cases. It allows people to provide support to one another. It allows people to provide information with one another. When I was growing up, learning how to do, whatever you might learn about, woodworking or fixing your car or fixing a computer or whatever, that was all hard information to get. And now, of course, there are dozens of videos online that allow you to teach yourself how to do these things. So that's a real positive thing. That lack of a gatekeeper also means that people with hateful messages or people who want to, say false things or whatever, they also have the ability to speak without that gatekeeper. And I think that the risk here is that we're going to turn the rules such that we get the gatekeeping for the content we don't want, but we're also going to get that gatekeeping over content that we probably do want. And that allows people to try to suppress that kind of information. It really turns the internet from a system that allows us to communicate with one another easily into a broadcast medium that is tightly controlled. Sort of turns the internet into cable TV.
Such a great point. And many social problems, though, like misinformation, are not solely the fault of the internet. So I'm curious, how do you think that narrative can be better shifted to address the root causes rather than just the mediums?
I think this is a really important point. I mean, there's a lot of complaining, for instance, about misinformation online. And it's true, there is misinformation online. Nobody can doubt it. But, some of the most pernicious misinformation comes from some of our political leaders. It comes through television networks. It comes through broadcast radio. These are also sources of that kind of information. And I think we need to stop blaming the technology for what really amounts to a social problem. We have a society that is deeply divided. It is possible that the internet is exacerbating that, but it's also possible that what's really happening is that the internet is exposing the divisions within our cultures. And if that's the case, then we can regulate the internet all day long. The divisions are not going to go away as a result of that. I think that one of the things the internet does allow us to do is to uncover these divisions and to understand them and to find ways to talk to one another. It is not the case right now that all of our social media systems, that all of our platforms and so on are good at providing that kind of experience. And I think we probably want to continue to work on ways of making sure that we have positive social development from this tool that is potentially a positive social tool. But I think that, simple-minded regulation that turns it into broadcast television is very unlikely to provide those kinds of experiments. What's more likely to happen is that we will have, it will tend to encourage the current dominant platforms or the current dominant players to be permanent favorites, and that's not the kind of thing that we want. I think it's important when you hear somebody who is a dominant player in any market say that they welcome regulation. You need to, reach for your wallet and ask, okay, who's this regulation going to benefit? In the United States, for instance, AT&T worked very, very hard to maintain its regulated monopoly for much of the 20th century, and that was because it was incredibly profitable for AT&T. It was a very good deal for them to have a regulated monopoly, but it wasn't necessarily good for the whole society. AT&T invented magnetic tape, for instance, the kind of, the old-fashioned tape recorder tape, long before it was commercialized. And they put it on the shelf and patented it and then put it on the shelf because they thought that it could be a competitive threat to their long-distance business. That's not good for the society. It's good for AT&T, but it's not good for the wider society. And we should ask ourselves if we're going to regulate this technology, the internet, in favor of the current state of affairs or maybe trying to go back to some state of affairs that we liked before, who's going to benefit from that kind of regulation and who won't? I don't think we know. And I think most of the time, what we see is that those kinds of arrangements are very often extraordinarily beneficial to the established players and much less good for everybody else.
And I also think it's important to highlight issues related to the internet are often incredibly narrow and technical, making them difficult to address through legislation on its own. So I'm curious, are there any examples of such issues and maybe a few alternative approaches to tackling them that might spring to mind?
Oh, well, a really good example we already touched on, which is the Online News Act in Canada. The Online News Act is really an attempt to try to make sure that newspapers remain vital. That's the goal of it. The news business is in big trouble, and it's in big trouble around the world, and that's because historically it was funded through advertising. Advertising has all moved online, and it has overwhelmingly moved to two platforms who are very, very profitable with it. But what that means, of course, is that your local newspaper doesn't have those advertisements anymore, and they don't have the revenue from it. So the attempt was to move it online, to try to extract some of that money from the people who are being successful with advertising and transfer it to the news business. The thing is, the problems in the news business are not new. The news business in Canada has had concentration problems since the 1980s, and we've been talking about it over and over again. So this is really a broad social problem, and the internet has simply exposed the fundamental structural problems in there. And so, a better way to have done this would have been to try to address the structural problems within the news business. There's a similar issue having to do with many other kinds of technology of industries that have been affected by the internet. You see different kinds of attempts to change the travel business in order to deal with the way the online environment has changed. And I think we see also a lot of people attempting to cope with the realities of financial concentration through trying to break down the way the internet works. It would be much better in that case to try to address the issues of corporate concentration more generally. The internet companies, the large tech companies, are not the only concentrated corporations in the universe. Indeed, the largest corporation by revenue in the world is not a tech company at all. It's Walmart. So we have to ask ourselves, what problem is it that we actually think we're trying to solve? And in some cases, there are narrow technical problems. The internet has, for instance, a narrow technical problem having to do with routing security. So when you connect from one network to another, you use an internetworking routing protocol called the Border Gateway Protocol. And this protocol was not designed with a lot of security in it, and so we've added a bunch of security fixes to it. But a lot of networks don't implement those things because, of course, it costs them money. Well, there's a narrow technical problem because it does have consequences. It's possible, for instance, to use these routing vulnerabilities to cause you to go to the wrong website, and that seems like a problem. If it turns out to be your bank that is being announced that way, that's a real problem. So maybe we've got some narrow technical things that could be dealt with by regulation. I think that particular one is better dealt with through industry action. We are very proud to have sponsored an effort called Manners to try to get that routing security more widely adopted. But there might be some narrow technical things that would be best dealt with through regulation. What is much more problematic are these huge sweeping things that are attempts to fix social problems such as corporate concentration or such as, desirable business lines that are in trouble through changing the way the network itself works. That this is a narrow technical fix for a much bigger social problem. And in general, tech fixes for social problems often don't work.
And it's also important to remember that the internet has brought about numerous benefits, from democratizing information to fostering global connections. So with all that in mind, how do you think we can better ensure that regulatory actions don't stifle these advantages and turn the internet into a domain dominated by just a handful of corporations?
Well, I think that, first of all, recognizing that the internet is so beneficial is one of the critical things to do. It's easy to focus on the problems, particularly if you live in a well-connected society. So one of the hypotheses that I have, in fact, is that many of these regulations are being written by people because, many people who support legislators are quite earlier in their career. Legislative aides and so on are often very young. And those are people who have never lived without the internet. They've never experienced life where they don't have connectivity and pretty good connectivity. Well, that it becomes very natural then to assume that the internet is, everlasting and it's just going to be there and all you need to do is tweak it around the edges. But in fact, the internet is much more fragile than we might suppose. It is technically robust. It has this property where, because of its large redundancy, it allows us to build this reliable system out of unreliable parts. It's really surprising how good it is. But from the point of view of its governance and from the point of view of the politics of it, it's actually quite fragile because it requires everybody to agree to the basic idea that more connectivity is good. And if we forget that connectivity is a positive benefit, then we very quickly start to break the internet up into little pieces. And we see this over and over again with governments that are trying to do internet shutdowns. We see lots of internet shutdowns around the world, and they're getting bigger and they're getting worse. We see countries that are adopting legislation that is an attempt to keep, past business models alive, or to try to control data and keep it within their geopolitical boundaries, the so-called digital sovereignty, and we see large companies who are really trying to build a sort of vertical integration within the internet and keep you within their ecosystem, or they call it an ecosystem. It's really a park, right? It's a walled garden. And they try to keep you inside because that's part of their revenue model. So what we need to do is remember what the internet brought us and all of the benefits that we get from it. I know that it's popular to hate on various social media platforms because of problems on them. But a few years ago, I was at a meeting with some young people who live in very remote locations. It was the Indigenous Connectivity Summit, and they built themselves a platform within one of those social media platforms. They built themselves a little network that allowed them to connect with one another because they live in very remote communities, and there's a huge problem of suicide among young Indigenous people in Canada. And so they built themselves a network for them to connect with one another. It's called We Matter. And it was a beautiful story that reminded me how important it is that the internet allows us to connect with one another and to give each other the kind of support that really literally saves lives. If we forget about that, we will lose those opportunities, and we will have to depend on central authorities to provide that kind of support for people. And we all know those central authorities often are not that good at it. The people who are best positioned to look after themselves are people themselves. And we can build those kinds of things in communities if we have the tools, and the internet provides that tool. But we need to make sure that we remember we get that tool out of the internet, because if we forget and think, oh, it's just another broadcast medium and it's all controlled by these 5 companies, then we will build a system that is centralized like that, and we will lose the opportunities that humanity has inherited because of the inventors of the internet.
And given some of these complexities that we've talked about today, what role do you see Internet Society playing in advocating for a more balanced approach to internet governance? I appreciate, I'm not sure how much you can share with me today on the podcast, but are there any initiatives or frameworks that you're currently working on that will help address some of the things we're talking about here?
Well, it is our focus to try to make sure that the internet is for everyone. And we consistently try to build tools, and we try to intervene with governments and with corporations to make sure that those considerations are there. So that's the reason, for instance, that we have this framework of the Internet Impact Assessment. And, we advocate for that consistently around the world. When we talk to governments, we say, oh, if you're considering this regulation, why don't you do this assessment to see what the consequences are? We are happy to consult with anybody and to talk to anybody about what the consequences might be in the approach that they're taking. It's much easier to do that before you have adopted legislation, for instance. It's often hard to fix something that's passed. And so, that's one of the things that we try to do. We continue to work on the issue of encryption. Encryption is critically important to ensure that the experience online is safe and secure. Without strong end-to-end encryption, your banking information is at risk. And what we see is that people are trying to tear down encryption and make it weaker because they say, oh, well, this is something that law enforcement needs or whatever. And it's always because of either, there's a terrorist problem or because children are going to be abused by this. I understand why people make those arguments, but it's important to remember that the same technology is what allows us to defend ourselves against terror, for instance, because, if you really want a terrible movie plot, imagine you wake up in the morning and everybody's bank account is empty. because the encryption was weakened, and some evil genius got hold of the encryption keys and overnight went in and emptied everybody's bank account. That would cause panic, and it would cause real terror. And that is one of the things that strong encryption gives us. Children who are being abused need to be able to share that information securely with somebody. They need to be able to reach out. And the only way to protect those communications is with strong end-to-end encryption. So these are the kinds of issues that the Internet Society is always pushing on. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have our board meeting, and we will be releasing our new action plan for 2024. We have just finished a consultation within our community about our next 5-year plan. But the central themes of these remain defending the internet and making sure that it is for everyone. So that's what we continue to work on. We need help. People can join the Internet Society. It doesn't cost anything. And of course, we need financial resources too. We are a charity, and we appreciate any donation that anybody gives to us. But we will continue to press forward to make sure that this marvelous tool remains something that all humanity can benefit from.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share your insights around the importance of ensuring that the internet is for everyone and continues to be for everyone. And as a little thank you, I'm going to see if there's something we can do for you now, because some of the biggest names in business, VC funding, and either tech have either been guests or might even listen to this podcast. So is that a person that you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with? Who would it be and why? Because he or she might be listening, and we'll see what we can manifest together here today.
What a great question. There is an author whom I love, Neil Gaiman, and he is incredibly inventive. And one of the reasons that I would love to talk to him or to have a little sit down is because it's sometimes hard to imagine what bad ideas could be a threat to the internet. And I think somebody who has such a creative, speculative mind will think of threats that I haven't even thought of. So it would be a tremendous opportunity to kind of deal with a potential future. Also, I just love the things that he writes.
Awesome. We'll throw that out into the universe. Let's see what we can manifest together. And finally, before I let you go, for anyone listening, maybe they want to find out more information about the Internet Society, maybe even get involved and join you guys. What's the best starting point for everything?
The best way is to go to our website, which is internetsociety.org. And you can go to that website. Well, there's all kinds of information there. You can join from that link. Of course, we have a little donation button if you want to donate and help us continue to make sure that the internet is for everyone. But we encourage everybody to sign up and join our worldwide community that allows us to work together to make sure that everybody gets to benefit from this marvelous technology.
Well, again, I cannot thank you enough for coming on here today. So much gold in our conversation, talking about how large corporations are working hard to almost enclose the internet, and governments wrestling both with issues of real concern too. It's such a big talking point. I'd love to keep this conversation going with people listening, see what they thought. But just a big thank you for joining me today and sharing your story, Andrew.
Thank you for welcoming me onto your podcast.
So a big thank you to Andrew Sullivan there for sharing his invaluable insights into the often opaque world of internet policy and governance. Quick shout out to any IT or business leaders listening to the show. Adopting Apple Mac at scale isn't purely an IT decision. It's a business decision. And like it or not, it may be driven by leaders or executive leadership for a variety of reasons. And a new podcast called We Got Your Mac is designed to help decision makers understand the pros and cons of Mac adoption and help the IT leaders they're working with to understand how to create the very foundations of a successful Mac rollout. So while helping frontline IT admins know where to get practical advice on supporting the platform in a mixed environment, check out wegotyourmac.com. You'll be able to find all the previous episodes as well as additional information from SHI, Apple and other partners to help you and your business at every step of their Mac adoption journey. So check that out. As always, if you've got anything that you would like to raise that maybe we missed in the conversation, I'd love to bring you into this. If you'd like to come and join me on the podcast, if you've got a question, whatever it is, I'm nice and easy to get hold of. techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC. Let me know your thoughts. But that's it for today, so just a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.